there in the camera view. We're going to do like I said, we'll do the base coat together. It'll be one of the early steps, so we have lots of time for it to dry. Your zenithal was from the front right. Okay, so that, yeah, it will help to do a little bit of highlighting. Alexa's telling me to drink some water. I always forget to drink water during the day, so Alexa always reminds me to stay hydrated every day. I think instead today I'll drink a little bit of coffee. Oh, now Alexa's texting me to tell me to drink water. I tend to zone out when once I get started for the day of painting in here. All right, so we're going to get rolling in the usual mode now. We've got, for me, it's just coming up on 1 o'clock, so 11 Central, so it's the right time to get rolling. And if you've taken my classes before, you'll know that I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes, actually 7 minutes, but I'm trying to get it down to 6 or 5 as I get better at this whole spiel. My name's Geoff Davis. I'm going to be doing this paint along on planning and painting a tartan for the next couple of hours. And right off the bat, if you're just joining in, you haven't heard the preamble that I was giving. We're going to be painting the back of the miniature. We're going to be working on this cloak here. So if you don't have any kind of highlighting or shading or anything like that done on the cloak yet, you're going to have a few minutes to do that. I'm going to talk about tartan a little bit, and then we're going to do a practice on a separate piece of paper, a piece of plastic or whatever. So if you have a few moments now, throw a little bit of shading, a bit of highlighting on there now, so it'll be dry by the time we get to do the base coat. And that'll really help with the final look of the tartan once it's done, in about 90 minutes before we're done that. Okay, and I'll just leave that sitting there as a reminder. Okay, so what are we going to be doing now? Of course, I added an extra minute to my intro by saying that, but right, off we go. Oh, awesome. We got about 60 people already. That's awesome. I think the last tartan class we did, we had about 75 people, something like that. And a lot of people posted their painted tartans when they were done, and it was fabulous. Some really interesting work, really good stuff. All right, so I'm Geoff Davis, like I said earlier, and first thing I always do on these classes, I'm just going to say thanks to Reaper. And in fact, John's moderating today, which is awesome, so he can hear me say thanks firsthand. I have felt really supported by Reaper, particularly in the last couple of years. You know, we run paint and take classes here in the studio. We do beginner classes all the time, and the way Reaper approaches like this bit, the hobby, is really supportive of beginners getting started. The miniatures are good quality, but they're affordable. What I really like about a lot of the miniatures is that the way that they're sculpted is that they're accessible. A beginner can get a brush in there, can learn the basics, can paint the miniature. And when you combine that with the way the Reaper MSP paints work, they dry quite quickly. Beginner can paint a miniature in 90 minutes and go away with, you know, a keen interest and a chance to follow on in the hobby. So I love the way Reaper does that. I also want to say thanks for running these events. I think these are awesome. I took a class yesterday. I did Ian Marcon's class before I started my chain of 3 classes that I did. And this opportunity is awesome. I really believe in taking classes. I think it's fabulous. And I love that Reaper sets this up and that it's free and accessible to everybody around the world to take this. I think it's fabulous. I do want to give a shout out to a couple of instructors that I take every class I can, and some of the instructors have been really fabulous. In particular, Miniature Monthly has made a huge difference for me. I subscribe to their Patreon, and I take classes from Aaron Lovejoy one-on-one every month, and they are fabulous. If you're not involved with them, I highly recommend it. There's stuff for beginners and very advanced stuff as well, and really fabulous. So a little bit about me and my background. I've been a miniature hobbyist for a long time. I got my first miniatures in 1979, and it's the one hobby that I've had ever since. It's the one hobby that survived my career. And when I retired a few years ago, I made miniature painting my full-time activity. So teaching classes, doing commissions, participating in conventions, all that kind of stuff. This is what I do all day, every day, and I love it. And yeah, My business is called Hecatina Miniature Painting Studio. Hecatina is the name of a D&D character that I played for about 5 years, like 2005 to 2010, somewhere in there. Very bad-tempered fairy that liked to kill dragons. So we have a bit of a fairy theme going on here in the studio. We ran our last painting contest using Reaper Sylph. Everybody had to paint the same model. We have fairies hidden all over the studio for kids to find when they come in. And yeah, it's kind of what we do. So yeah, that's pretty much it. We have a website where people can buy miniatures and have them painted. We have behind me here is a 700 square foot classroom where we can host lots of classes. We can have up to 18 people at a time in here painting when COVID's not an issue. And one of the things that I really love right now is that other painters in the area are dropping in. There's other commission painters drop in here to buy figures that they paint for other people. We have an inventory of Dark Sword, Infinity, and tons of Reaper miniatures. And so we get a little bit of a community feel going on here where people drop in to talk about their painting projects and stuff like that, which is fabulous. I love it. If you're interested in taking a painting class from me, there's a link on my website where you can sign up for a class, and it's super easy to do. And look at that, I managed to get it down to 4 minutes of me giving my spiel. So that's, there you go. Okay, so now I'm going to be, I'm not going to be looking at the chat anymore, John. I'm going to be just looking at my own screen. And so don't hesitate to jump in if there's a question, or you just want to ask me something yourself. More than happy to kind of chat with you as we go. And just remind everybody, if you do have questions, throw them in the Q&A section so that it's easier for John to grab them. And because when the chat starts rolling, it tends to go by pretty quick and questions get missed. And I think that is enough about all of that. Okay, so one more time, I'm just going to remind people that we're going to be painting this, the Highlander heroine here. And my version, I sculpted a new skirt onto her so I could do have an example of the tartan painted for the class. And what we're going to focus on today is we're going to paint that same tartan on the back. That's where we're going to focus. So we're going to do a few other things for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we're going to come back to the miniature. So while I'm gabbing, if you don't have any highlighting or shading on your miniature at all, I encourage you to do a bit of that now. We are going to put a base coat of the main color of the tartan over top of this, but it really helps to have some highlighting and shading first, because that underpainting influences the highlighting and shading of the tartan we put on top. And tartans typically woven in wool, and they're quite flat, so they don't have themselves a lot of shine or really bright highlights or really dark shadows. So when we go and we paint it, we're not going to do a lot of highlighting and shading of the tartan itself. We're going to let the underpainting give us our highlight and shadows. So if you haven't done any kind of shading or anything like that, take a few minutes, throw some, some deep shadows in there, throw a couple of lighter highlights on top. This is what I'm going to paint over. You can see it's not perfect, but not beautiful by any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't have to be anything too complex, but it'll help in the long term. Okay, and then I'm just going to put her down there. And I'm going to switch over to this very short PowerPoint slide thing that we've got going on. You can skip that. All right, my interest in painting tartan. My studio here is in Nova Scotia, and my daughter is heavily into Highland dancing, and we've traveled back and forth from Scotland a few times. She's gone to some pretty big Highland dancing competitions, and there's kilts and tartan and plaidis around our house all the time, and always kind of had a visual interest in it. And then there was a D&D game where a player joined us and asked me to paint his miniature for him. I said, sure, that's awesome. What would you like on it? And this is the picture he sent me. This is the Royal Stuart tartan, one of the more complex tartans out there to paint. So I was like, how hard can it be? Let's just go for it and see what happens. Let's see if we can pull this off. And I was a little cranky at first, but I was like, all right, I'm going to show you. Let's do this. So I grabbed this beat up old Templar miniature that I'd had sitting around for a few years and just kind of went for it. And what I discovered was it's not as easy as you might think at first. In fact, when you look at that, that's a pretty complex pattern of shapes. I didn't think it was going to be easy. I thought it was going to be tough. And by going through this process, I posted some of my work in progress on the Reaper forum and got some feedback from people. And I realized through this that you can't really just, particularly on 28mm miniatures, you can't just take the tartan and try to paint it exactly as is. The quantity of lines, the number of intersections, the complexity, and then if you try to make it as small as it needs to be, look how tight those patterns are on that, like on his bagpipe there. That's a pretty small area to have all those intersections of lines. And look how complex. I mean, this is pretty complicated stuff. So what we're trying to do is not paint the tartan verbatim. We're trying to give the impression of that tartan, of its colors, of its shapes. And then when somebody looks at that 28mm miniature, they get the impression of the tartan rather than it being exactly like it. I'll give you another example of that. So here's another one that I did, I think last year. This is the Wilson Ancient, I believe. Yeah, Wilson Ancient. And when you look closely at this, particularly, it's got this interesting orange and blue kind of transition going on in some areas. Like if you look in there, you have to kind of ask yourself, is this blue, green, or orange? And there's an optical illusion happening there where, because of the interactions of all these orange lines, your brain starts filling in and creates a blended color between this blue and this orange and gives us this interesting kind of green-orange mix in the middle. But if you pulled those threads out and looked at them closely, it's still blue and orange threads. So there's a really interesting things that can happen in a lot of these tartan patterns. And you look closely at, for example, here, there are 16 tiny squares there. It's the intersections of two sets of 4 lines. And trying to paint that on a 28mm miniature, super tough. So rather than do that, we try to break down the tartan. What I like to do is break it down into its essential components, paint those, and then that gives the impression of the tartan. So if you look very closely in around there on Aislinn here, rather than having these groups of 4 lines, I've kept these groups of lines, but these ones I've made into pairs of parallel orange lines. And the key shapes, the one that really stand out on this tartan, are the intersections of the white lines. And I kept those. And so when you look at the tartan, you get that same impression, you get that same strange green color, that's the overlap of the orange and blue lines, but I didn't have to go through that near impossible exercise of painting all those tiny little orange lines. I got the impression of the tartan. So this is the one we did during ReaperCon Live, and this is the McIntyre tartan, and basically went through that exercise of identifying where the key colors are, what are the key shapes. You have to ask yourself, what is the background color, what's the foreground color? And that will help you kind of think through, what color do I put down first? What colors do I put down next? What colors are stronger? Which colors are weaker? For example, this white line is really strong. It doesn't, like, sometimes when you look at white lines on a tartan, they look broken because they're intersected by black lines or they're intersected by white blue lines. So they appear more like dashes than straight white lines or straight yellow lines. On this particular tartan, the white line is very dominant. So generally speaking, that means that's the most dominant feature. It's going to be the thing we paint last. On this one, the red dominates over the blue. So working our way back, the red is probably going to be the second last thing we would paint. The green, to me, looks like it's the base color, the background color. So that's going to be first. So then our sequence will be green, blue, red, and then do the white. And then, of course, within each step, there's going to have to be a few little things done to make it work. And in this case, once you take it from being a large, life-size pattern, and you take it down to the scale of our miniature, this green line is invisible. You won't be able to see that green line on the painted miniature. It'll disappear into the blue, which means that essentially, instead of having two blue lines, I just have one blue line. And the question we ask ourselves is it possible to paint these red lines within the space that I'm going to give to these blue lines? And maybe the answer is no. So instead of trying to paint something that complex, we replace it with just a single red line where that green line used to be, because at a distance it's going to be similar colors. It's going to give us an impression of the same tartan. Another option would be to use those red lines to create a boundary around the blue to separate it from the green, to make it visually more easy to identify. And one trick that I've used a number of times painting different tartans, particularly very dark tartans, is I'll use a black line to outline, even though in the tartan pattern it doesn't have black lines, I'll use a black line to define those main elements so that they're easier to visually identify on a very small figure. And I'll show you that with this tartan that we're going to do today, even though the tartan we're going to paint doesn't actually have that. So what are we going to paint today? So we have connected to the Hecatina Miniature Painting Studio Facebook page. There's a small Facebook group. It's not that small. It's about 70 people now. And it's called the Tartan Painting on Miniature Support Group, which is kind of a mouthful, but as soon as you start typing any of those words in, it's like the only thing that Facebook will give you. So it's pretty easy to find. And the aim of that little Facebook group is to give a place for people to post their pictures of tartan that they've been painting or that they've been working on, post tartans that they found, that they have an idea that they want to paint, and get advice on how to paint that tartan. And so in that group, I asked people, what miniature would you like to see us paint for Reaper Virtual Expo? What tartan would you like to see painted? And people came back with quite a few interesting suggestions. One of the interesting things about tartans in the modern world is people register them and copyright them. So some tartans, and some of the tartans that were suggested, I actually couldn't legally use without permission, because this is going to be a recorded video that goes on YouTube. So I would need permission to actually use that tartan in the class. So we boiled it down to some miniatures that had some nice kilts and some good shapes for painting, as well as some tartans that had good contrast to make them easier to see in the class and had some interesting colors. And the Facebook group voted, and they picked these. So the miniature we picked, obviously, was the Highlander heroine, and the tartan that got picked is this purple, green, and white one, which is the suffragette tartan. And it is not, and it's registered in the Scottish Registry of Tartans, but it is not copyrighted. So we can use this, no problem. And interesting, tomorrow is International Women's Day. So I thought that is a great choice. And then I grabbed the Highlander heroine and discovered that she didn't have a skirt. It was kind of, had an interesting dress going on. And I wasn't quite sure which part of her we would paint the tartan. So that's why I sculpted a skirt onto her, so she's a bit better dressed. And gave her the suffragette tartan on her skirt there. And that's what we're going to paint today. That's how we got here. And it's kind of an interesting tartan, for a great one for practicing on. I'll probably use this again for classes in the future. And we look at its essential elements. There's only 3 colors here, which is good. The background color, this color back here, that to me looks like it's the lowest color. So that's going to back up a step. So approaching any new tartan that I'm going to paint, I'm trying to break it down into its essential colors and its essential elements. So the first thing I always like to do is identify what is really the main background color. And the way tartan is made, the way the threads are woven together, you could actually pick either the purple or the green. Either one of those could be the background color. We could say this is purple with green stripes over it. Or we could say this is green with purple stripes over it. Or we could say this is white with purple and green stripes over it. But as a cloth, all of these colors actually pretty much have equal strength in the cloth. It's only when we go to paint it and we're trying to create layers of paint, they have to figure out which one is on top, which one is dominant. And one of the questions that I ask myself is, which of the stripes are going to be easiest to manage to paint? So as I look at this one, we've got 2 different sizes of purple stripes and really essentially 1 size of green stripes. So making things look perfectly even with all those green stripes is actually more difficult, in my experience, than making 2 different sizes of purple stripes. I can make more mistakes with 2 different sizes of purple stripes, and it's still less noticeable than if I made small mistakes in the consistent green stripes. So for me, that means green is the background. I'm going to paint purple on top of that because it's going to hide my mistakes, and we like that. So the next thing I'm thinking about in breaking down the pattern is, what is going to give me good landmarks? And by landmarks, I mean, I need a way to place the tartan on the figure that's going to enable me to keep the pattern consistent size, consistent orientation on the folds and different shapes on the cloth that we're going to paint. So one of the challenges is that tartan as a cloth, this heavy wool cloth that tartan is usually made from, doesn't stretch very easily. It doesn't deform very easily. Its surface area is pretty much constant. But the person sculpting the miniature doesn't have that limitation. The green stuff or whatever they sculpted it with, they can pull and stretch and deform it however they want, which means that surface area is not going to be consistent the way a cloth would be, which means that as we go to lay our tartan across it, keeping the pattern consistent is going to be very difficult. If we were doing something like a fleur-de-lis pattern or like a complex embroidered pattern, we could choose to deform that pattern to match the miniature, and it doesn't lose kind of its identity. But as soon as you start taking a tartan with its 90-degree intersections of lines and deforming it so that the lines don't intersect at 90 degrees, so the lines aren't parallel anymore, it's really obvious. You can see it right away. So it is a bit of a challenge to keep that consistent, and that's why the most really identifying what you're going to paint first to give you those landmarks is really important. And on this tartan, it's very easy. To me, it's very straightforward. Those white lines are all consistent spacing. They make perfect squares, which means that it's going to be a perfect grid. So I'll use that first to establish my landmarks, and then I'll use those landmarks to paint the purple lines on top of them. And because the white is the most dominant color, I'll go back and redo the white at the end. So it's going to be green, purple. Well, actually, we're going to start with, green. Then we're going to do a light gray line for the white lines. Then we're going to do the purple, and then we're going to do the white on top of that at the end. So this is the plan. All right, I'm going to go back to our overhead view. John, do we have any questions pending yet?
There was one submitted earlier. It says, what color would you recommend for the base coat?
Okay, so we are going to put the base coat on right now. I've started out with this, I think kind of Zenithal highlighted that. It's just black, gray, and then white ink or something like that. But what we're going to do now is we're going to lay in that green color first to be our background color of the tartan. And we're going to do that first, and we're going to let it dry. And while it's drying, we're going to go and practice the tartan on a piece of plastic, or if you grab a piece of paper, that'll work too, so that we can get a sense of how easy it's going to be to paint the lines. We're going to practice the lines a bit, and then that'll tell us how small we can make the pattern or how big we have to make it to be able to manage it. So first steps first, we're going to build our palette. First thing I'm going to get you to grab is the Dragon Black. We don't need very much of that. We're going to use that as a demo at the end to do some black lines. Don't need too much of that. Then we need our warm green, which I can't remember the name or the number of that. I think it's 9011 warm green. Doesn't really matter. You just kind of need a mid-tone warm green. And this actually for me was one of the challenges, was figure out what colors to use for that background, because it's not really green, it's not really blue, it's not really teal. So we're going to fake it. We're going to make up our own color. So the next color we need is our 9077 marine teal. We're gonna need quite a bit of these two colors because we're gonna mix those to make our background color. And then we need the purple. And then for the purple, we are gonna use 9023 Imperial Purple, which is a little bit darker, I think, than the purple there, but in the practice model, it actually looked pretty good. So I'm happy with that. And then we're gonna use linen white as our white. And if you have any inks lying around, one of the things we're going to do on our practice card is I'll show how to make the lines easier by mixing a little bit of ink in with the paint. So if you happen to have some white ink and black ink lying around, grab a drop of that on your palette as well. So that's a drop of white ink. This is not required. This is optional stuff. But if you have it, it'll be fun to play with. Oh, if I can even get it open. That is not happening. Need a plumber's wrench to get that ink open. No, that is not going to happen. So I'll try to open the black ink again later, but we'll see if we can get there. And the other thing we're going to need is a little bit of Flow Aid. I'm just going to put a drop of that down at the bottom of my palette. And in the final stage, we're going to glaze on the base coat. So we're going to start with the base coat. And then at the end, just like any freehand pattern, we're going to tie it into its background by glazing the green back over it. And when we go to that stage, I'm going to grab a bit of Reaper wash medium to really thin that out. And I'll add that to my palette at the end so I don't accidentally mix that in with everything else as we're going along. Okay, so the base coat color. I'm going to mix this green and the blue together, basically 50-50, and that's going to be my my background color. Let's get a beat up old brush here. Need quite a bit of this. I'm going to have to cover quite a lot with it. All right, there we go. That's it looks pretty shiny on the webcam there, but it's a much closer color to the one in the swatch that we've got up above there. And once we put this over that that background, it's going to get a little bit paler, and that should work pretty well. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to use this flat number 2 to put on the base coat. And I don't intend this to be a fully opaque base coat that completely blocks everything underneath. I want that underpainting of shadows and highlights to come through. If you don't have that on your miniature, feel free to give 2 thin coats so you get nice nice coverage, and there'll be enough time for it to dry while we're messing around with the practice sheet. I am going to thin this quite a bit as a result so that it goes on smoothly. So if you're going to paint along, you want to do this now. You don't want to wait, because I'm going to just do this quickly and then move on to the practice piece of plastic. Just to show you what I'm going to use for that, I'm just going to grab an old blister pack that I've sprayed. And if you have a piece of paper, it'll work for the same thing just fine. And in fact, we might as well base coat that at the same time as we're doing this one.
Can you go up in frame just a little bit?
Thank you. It's a little too thin. Sticking that back up. So generally speaking, painting the tartan, or if you're painting a plaid pattern or anything like that, it's like most freehands, it's a final step on your figure. It's not something you're going to do early on. And that's why I've got most of this model already painted. You know, after doing this, I can stick a few tufts on there, tufts of grass. And this, maybe, actually, I forgot to do the non-metallic metal on that sword, but other than that, this model is finished. So this is something that you do right at the end. And one hint is that you're going to rotate the model in your hands a lot. And that means, you know, your skin is going to touch the model in the painted areas quite a bit. And of course, the oils in your skin will soften acrylic paint, make them rub off. So it is sometimes helpful to spray a matte varnish onto the figure after you've done the base coat, so that you can handle it more aggressively without worrying about just simply rubbing the paint off. And I'm going to go right around and curve this. I'm going to take the pattern right around onto the front of the cloak, and I've made like a little, I painted in a black line that's going to be where the cloak meets up with its lining on the front. I've already kind of painted that like it's like a wool color. I'm going to do the same thing on the front on the other side. Flip her over there to make it easier to get in there. And there we go. You see how the shading that I did in advance really shows through, and the highlights really show through that, giving me a nice bit of relief. And once that dries and it's nice and matte, that's going to be a good background to then go and paint our pattern onto. That's all we really need it to be. It doesn't need to be any more saturated than that. If you didn't already have any highlighting and shading, I encourage you to do a second coat on there. And by the time we're done messing around with a piece of paper, that'll be done. All right, so there's our piece of plastic. So through the magic of the internet, John is going to do a cut scene. And there, we passed the time, and there's my piece of plastic, nice and ready to go, all dried up and ready. So while I'm messing around with this, I encourage you, paint your piece of paper green, and it'll be dry super quickly. So there's our green background, very much like what we've got on the cloak. Okay. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly and roughly map out the pattern of the tartan. And we're going to rehearse the steps that I'm going to use on the tartan, on the figure. And the reason I do this is because quite a few times I've started the pattern on the miniature and then discovered it does not work. The blue and the black blend into each other, become completely invisible. The reds and the oranges become completely invisible. And you get to a certain point where you realize that the project is just not going to work. The other day on the Facebook page, I had found this tartan called the Raven tartan. And somebody asked, how would you even paint that? And I thought to myself, I don't know. So I'll give it a try. I grabbed the first Bones Mini I could find out of the classroom box on the other side there. And said, all right, let's do this. What is the sequence going to be? And then I went and I painted it. And oh my, this does not look anything like the tartan that I had used as the example to work from. There are two different colors of blue and purple in this. There are two different colors of orange in this. You can't see them. They're completely invisible. The sequencing that I used totally did not work. And then when I tried to fix it by putting the black lines in the middle of the orange lines, did not work. And the orange would not go over the background colors effectively, and it made a mess. So if I'd rehearsed this on a piece of plastic, I could have changed the sequence and come up with something that would work. It would not look, you know, it's nice to have samples around that I can show people what doesn't work, but it's also nice to have it work by, you know, so that when your miniature's finished, you have something you can be proud of. This looks good at a distance of about 12 to 15 feet. I wouldn't look at it any closer than that though. All right, so that's why we do this rehearsal part. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab just a tiny dab of the Dragon Black. Is that what we're using? Yeah, Dragon Black. I'm gonna put it over here by the linen white, clean my brush off, and I'm gonna grab a big daub of linen white. I'm gonna mix that in with the Dragon Black. Why am I doing that? I'm doing that because if I make mistakes with the placement of my first set of lines, this is gonna be easier to paint over than if I use the linen white straight or use pure white ink. So this is gonna be easier to correct mistakes with. I'm going to put just a little bit of flow weight in there so that it'll flow off the brush a bit more smoothly. And one of the interesting things that I found happens when you're doing all these really straight lines is that the surface tension of the paint will actually pull the paint into a neater line than you actually paint it. So thinning with water actually can work quite well. But with because the surface tension increases and then that makes the lines actually go smoother. And if you do that on a piece of paper, the surface tension doesn't matter. On the piece of paper, the paint's going straight in. Not going to make a difference. On the sheet of plastic, the paint's a little bit repelled. So the surface tension will make a difference, similar to as if you're painting on a bones. And then the other factor, of course, is that, as I've been discovering the last 2 days, it is so dry here right now. My paint dries in the wet palette within 45 minutes. So that's why I'm adding a bit of flow aid in to kind of help me keep the paint flowing, even though it's drying up a bit. But I encourage you to experiment with thinning the paint with a little bit of water to see that effect on how straight you can make the lines. Yeah. And then, so I'm looking at my grid pattern there. It's pretty much just equal grids all around. So I'm just going to start by slapping down a grid of lines. I try to make because we've got 2 different thicknesses of the purple lines. I want to see that whole pattern. So I'm going to put down an intersection of 2 sets of 5 gray lines. And this doesn't have to be perfect. This is not our final thing. But one of the things that I find helps is we get ourselves in a comfortable painting position with our brush in a comfortable position. Then we align the thing we're painting to the brush and away we go. There's our first line. And then do a second one right next to it. I'm aiming to make them basically equally spaced. That's not too bad. It's not perfect, but it's not too bad. And it doesn't have to be perfect because we're practicing. Orient to the brush again, and away we go. I'm using a pretty much brand new Raphael size 0 8404, and it's got a very sharp tip on it. The tip's still in very good condition. And that makes it quite a bit easier to do the lines. You'll notice I did each of those sets of 5 lines without having to reload the brush. And that's an advantage of using a larger brush like that. If you use something like a 10-0 or a 5-0 brush to try to get your lines really fine, you'll find that the paint dries out before you get the line drawn. And that's not particularly helpful. So the next thing I want to do is I'm looking at my pattern of purple lines there. And I'm looking at, I've got skinny lines and fat lines from the purple. So I've got to figure out how that's going to fit into the real estate that I've got available. And I think what's going to happen is those equal distance spaced green lines that I've got, these lines, I'm not going to be able to have those perfectly spaced. I'm just going to accept that. And I'm going to use the purple. I'm going to grab a bunch of it and smooth it out. I'm going to put a tiny bit of flow weight in there. And I think I'm going to start with the skinny lines to see how steady I am today, because conditions change every day. Some days are just not good for painting tartan, same as they're not good for painting eyes. If your back is sore, you've just been working out in the gym, or your hands aren't steady, your eyes are tired, it can be more difficult. So we're going to practice to see how thin we can get those purple lines, because I'm going to want those quite thin. And it doesn't matter if it goes over the gray line, because we're going to repaint that white later. That's our landmark that we're going to use to keep us oriented. And I want to be able to control the width. So I'm not going to try to paint the whole line with one brush stroke. I'm going to paint the left side, and then I'm going to paint the right side. So there's my left side of the thin purple line. There's my right side. This is going to be a fat one. So this is going to be another thin one. That might be a little too wide. There we go. And that white line is just visible in the center of it as it dries. Then I'm going to grab my paint again, load up the brush again. Now this time I'm going to try to make the wide purple lines still fit in that space. So the difficult space is going to be in here. So I think I want it to be about that wide. Something like that. So I kind of give myself a sense of how big I want it to be. And then I'm going to paint the outside of each of those lines.
While you're doing this step,
Yep.
I have one question. Is it better to start with a dark background or a light background?
I found that it's better to start with a light background. And the reason for that is it's easier to make things dark than to make them light. So if I was trying to paint with this green paint over top of this purple, I don't think this green paint is going to mask that purple very well. So my experience has been, yeah, light background is easier to paint over with dark colors than dark painted over with light colors. And you're going to see that when we do some details in a couple of steps, how poor that coverage is of this purple. So now I've got my outside boundaries. I'm going to go back and fill in that space inside. Doesn't look the greatest, but doesn't look too bad either. All right. Now I need to go back and do that exact same pattern again, the other way. So thin. And we're going to do the fat one. So I'll kind of get a sense of where I want it to be lying. Looks about right. And if you're doing a complex pattern, sometimes it's helpful to go and actually mark those landmarks all the way through so that you don't accidentally miss when you're doing your brush stroke. It helps you keep your eye lined up as you make your brush stroke. To the outside, do the outside again. Yeah, my hands are getting a bit shaky already. And now I'm going to fill in that space in the middle. And there we go. Pretty convincing looking tartan already. No. All right. So one of the interesting things in the tartan patterns is where the same color line, where a line crosses over a line of the same color, those intersections, you get squares of pure color. And just by overlapping them, you can see we've already got the sense of those darker spots. But they're not really dark enough to be convincing when we get onto the final miniature. So we're going to want to reinforce, we want to kind of, as Aaron Lovejoy always says, insist on the color in those squares. So I'm going to take my my royal purple here. Is it royal purple I'm working with? Yes. Imperial purple. And I'm going to repaint just those squares to make sure the color is nice and dark in there. Now, on the screen, in the upper right-hand corner there, those look a little bit brighter than the purple we've got on our background here. So if we wanted to, we could add just a touch of linen white in there to make it a little bit more opaque. And that's really going to be your judgment call as to whether you want to do that. I did a sample one earlier, and I don't think it really needs, I didn't add anything into that. I just reinforced those squares. It didn't really need it. So, but that's your choice. I mean, yours may look different from mine. And certainly if you're doing a different kind of tartan or a different plaid, then you're going to have to make that decision depending on what colors you're working with. And I'm not going to be super obsessive about making these perfect. You can see that that's not a perfect pattern already, but it's giving the impression of a consistent grid. So when I do these squares, I'm just going to quickly fill them in. Doesn't have to be perfect. But we do want to be systematic. If you're jumping all over the place, you'll get to the end and discover you missed one intersection or you missed one square and it looks different than the others. And with the human brain working the way that it works, people will notice that. So let's do this one again. Am I still on screen? Yeah, pretty much. Turn it and do these ones. And then I'm going to do those little square intersections as well. Tiny ones. There we go. All right. So what's next? Let me remind myself from my cheat sheet. Purple square is right. So when we look back at our sample, the green hash, where the purple and the green intersect, the cloth texture is quite visible through that. It's kind of like a hatch mark. And one of the interesting things about this kind of wool cloth is that, say you make a kilt out of it, for the entire kilt, that pattern, that texture direction is going to be the same through every color, from any direction of view. That orientation is going to be the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab some more of my blue-green. Oh, should clean my brush first before I do that. And to lighten up these spaces in between, I'm going to put a hatch mark across them. Now, I'm not trying to do a perfect, beautiful texture. I'm just trying to give an impression of those marks. So I can do this quite quickly. It has to be relatively consistent across the whole figure. And it's okay if I miss it a little bit, because the color that I'm painting right now is the background color. And this will disappear a little bit into the background if I miss. But it does help quite a bit with giving the impression of this being a cloth. And again, you want to be pretty systematic doing this so that you don't miss certain spaces. But that being said, you don't, not like the squares, but with this, you don't have to hit everything. As long as you do, and you don't have to do this at all. But if you do it in a few key areas, like not on the highest highlights and not in the deepest shadows, but kind of in between, it'll give the impression that everything has the same texture, even though it might not. And again, this is a bit of an illusion, right? We're giving the impression of a tartan rather than an actual perfect tartan. All right. There we go. So next thing we need to do is put back in our white lines. So I'm going to go back to that same gray that I used before, put a little bit more flow weight into it. And of course, I just put green paint in it because I'm sloppy. grab some fresh. And I'm going to put a tiny bit of the dragon black in there again. I don't want this to be my brightest. I want it to be just a little bit less than that. Because if you look back at our main pattern, other than in those central squares where it's all white, it's not really as bright as it could be, right? It's a little bit muted. So we're going to mute this a little bit by making it a little bit gray. And we're going to repaint those same white lines that we started with, because they're technically gray lines. And they're visible, so that gives us our landmark to hit, or miss completely, as I just did. That's unfortunate. Yeah, my hands are not super steady today. So one of the ways to make your line straighter, again, you find that comfortable brushing position so that you're always pulling the line towards yourself, just using the small muscles in your fingers, those finger joints. They're quite steady. And then you align your work to that brush stroke direction. And that's why my lines are going a bit crooked, is my back's a bit sore, so I'm not getting well aligned. But if you are well aligned, you can make nice straight lines. There we go. Now this is actually quite a bit easier to do in a small space, but the cloak that we're about to paint on this Highlander heroine is quite a large space. So we want to kind of get comfortable with doing these longer lines before we go back and attempt that. There we go. There's our pattern. And then I'm going to grab the straight linen white. I'm going to paint in those intersections, the little square of white paint.
Mary asks, would blending the purple into the white instead of gray give a more integrated color feel?
It would, but I'm going to show you a different way of doing that in a couple of seconds. That's a really good question. Essentially what I'm going to do is exactly what I did with the green over the purple. I'm going to now put hash marks going in the exact same orientation as the green ones, but with purple across the white. And what that'll do is those lines that you're correct look a little too bright right now, it's going to push them back a little bit. So I'll go back to my purple, a bit more flow weight in there. It's really important to go, before you go do these hash marks, to reshape the point on your brush. Make sure you don't have that like I've got right on there now. You can see that there's a little white dot of dried paint on the tip of that. So the paint's not going to flow very smoothly. So I got to clean that off before attempting this. Clean up my brush, reload it, reshape it. And as I said, it's so dry here today that I'm finding that the tip of the brush dries before I get, very many brush strokes done. So our hatch mark orientation is like this, right? So I'm going to keep that orientation when I do these purple ones. And I'll start at the top of this line. And I'm just going to, they don't have to be perfectly spaced. Just enough to break up that white line a little bit. Keep the orientation the same. And it'll push them right into the background. Not right into the background. It'll reduce them a little bit, kind of subdue them a little bit. And as you can see, it doesn't take very long to do that, especially if you're sloppy like me and you just let it go right over into the green a few times. When you do this on your heroine there, the space that you're working in is quite a bit smaller. So you might find that you might even only do maybe 2 or 3 in that space, and it's enough to give the impression that the texture is there, and it's enough to break up that white line a little bit. And then when we reorient our work, we're going to make sure we keep the hash marks on the same orientation, just like that. I hope that answers Mary's question. A little slower today than I usually am. I usually be done this within about 40 minutes. So we're a little behind schedule, but that's okay. There we go. So now we have a much more credible looking pattern that looks quite a bit more like our suffragette tartan up there. All right, so before I leave this and start going to because I'm quite happy with this, right? I'm happy with how this looks. I think it's going to look good on the figure. As I said at the start, I was going to talk a little bit about how to do smoother lines by mixing the ink together, and also how to define shapes by using the black lines. So on this one, I'm going to demonstrate by putting them on the outside of those purple blocks. But the other thing you could do here is actually, if you want to bring those white lines out a bit, is you could put a black line to the left and right of that white line, and that would make it stand out a bit better. And you quite often will see this in tartan patterns. There will be black lines strewn throughout the pattern. And quite often you can leave those out, especially if they're on a dark background. But if you have a black line on a light background, that can actually really add to the apparent complexity of the tartan without actually a lot of work. So for example, if I was to just put one through the center of each of those, suddenly our tartan looks really complex. So if you're going to try to define a line with it, you want to just put your black line along the outside edge of the line that you're trying to emphasize. Wow, shaky as all get out today. And that makes those lines stand out just a little bit more. And obviously it doesn't take very long. So this is one of the hazards in painting a complex tartan pattern. So adding a couple of lines made it look more complex. Adding those the black lines that are not part of the pattern, then adding the black lines that were outside those stripes almost makes it look so busy that you can't look at it. Your eye doesn't know where to go because it's so complicated. So that's one of the reasons why, in addition to making it easier to paint, when we look at the pattern and we try to break down the pattern into something manageable, it can be really useful to get rid of particularly some of these black lines if they're not necessary, because it can make it so complex that it's unpleasant to look at. Okay, so let me compare that to the one that I did earlier. Right, the one on the right looks, to my mind, more pleasing, and it's going to look better on the miniature. All right, so I'm going to start applying this on the figure. Yeah.
One real quick. What is the ratio of paint to flow aid? I know you said a little bit, but
Well, when I say a little bit, I mean a little, like tiny bit. So with the purple, I've been grabbing like 2 or 3 brushfuls of the purple paint, and then I'm literally just touching the tip of the brush to the flow aid, just enough that there's now a mixture of purple and flow aid in there, and that's enough to give you the flow enhancement to make it go smoother. For these stripes, that's probably as much as you need. If you start doing too much, it desaturates the paint, and then you're not going to get a nice smooth color. What's underneath it's going to show through more than you want it to. So I don't want to use too much of it. So no exact formula, but a little bit. All right, so here's our Highlander heroine. And now the first thing, and actually let me just show you now that we've kind of explored that pattern thoroughly, you can probably see pretty clearly now this same pattern on there, and you can probably see where my mistakes are as well. And I'll show you, for example, right there, you can see where the lines aren't parallel. That's not a 90-degree intersection in there. And that was because I glued her sword arm on before painting the pattern, so I couldn't get the brush in there. That's my excuse anyway. I was probably just like today, not very steady on my feet. All right, so when we're looking at her pattern now, we want to make a usable landmark to lay out the rest of the pattern. One of the things about the way tartan patterns are put into clothing, particularly for kilts, not necessarily for something which is a bit more modern, but particularly for kilts, the pattern is going to be, it's going to look like the pattern regardless of how many folds there are. Okay, so if it's a kilt with a whole bunch of knife pleats in different shapes and an apron in the front, when you look at it from a distance, the pattern is going to look like that, even though within that there's going to be 20, 30 folds. Okay, depending on the size of the pattern. It might only be 5 or 6 folds, could be more. So don't worry about trying to adjust the shape of the pattern across folds. Just superimpose it right across the top, because that skilled tailor is going to have, or kilt maker is going to have lined up the folds, the creases with the pattern, so it'll look right even if it's folded up. The second thing is that the horizontal lines are going to be parallel to the lower hem. So the lower hem here, okay, I mean, they're going to make it parallel at the top, but that means that as the cloth falls, it's going to be parallel. Those horizontal lines are going to be parallel to the hem at the bottom as well. Now on this miniature, the cloth is gathered at the top, which means that the vertical lines are going to be closer together at the top of the miniature. So what we need is both a center line, that's going to be our main vertical, and all the other vertical lines are going to be closing in on that one. And we need a horizontal line that's that's parallel to the hem, and that's the line off of which we're going to measure all of the other horizontal lines. So some people like to do the vertical lines first and gather them in, and then paint the horizontal lines in an arc to match those. Some people like to start with the horizontal line and then place the vertical ones on top of that. Matter of choice and preference in a lot of cases, but I think in this case where it's quite gathered at the top, if we do the horizontal lines first, we're going to run the risk that at the top of the figure, our vertical lines are not going to be at 90 degrees to the fall of the to the parallel lines, the horizontal lines. So I think we'll start with a vertical line on this one and then do the horizontal lines afterwards. So I messed up my gray. Going to make the gray all over again. There we go. We're going to need quite a bit of gray. How are we doing per time? Pretty good. So remember, this line is our landmark, and it's going to get covered up by the purple lines. So I'm going to look for a line that I can draw that's going to be on a raised surface to make it easier for me. And I look for a line that pretty much goes all the way from the top to the bottom. So like I wouldn't choose this fold because it goes into another fold part way up. I won't choose this fold because it disappears part way down. But this one and this one both could work pretty well. And as I'm kind of looking at her at a distance, I feel like this one here is the one that would be most vertical with just the way that the cloak falls. So that's the one I'm going to put in first. Going to orient, and this is kind of the most important one. So obviously I'm going to make a mistake here, but we'll make sure we get our comfortable painting position. We have enough reach to be able to make the whole line. And then moment of truth. Oh, look at that paintbrush dried before I was ready. Load her up again. And then just going to go for it. So I'm going to put a mark up there. That's my start point. I'm going to try to hit there. I'm going to go there. I'm going to go right off the bottom there. Now my brush might hit the base before I get there. That's why I've got those additional little points. Yeah, I'm really shaky today. I think I'm going to hold her upside down for this line. It might be a little bit easier for me. Got my landmark. Wow. That's a bit better. All right, there we go. So now we've got our first line in place. And I'm going to paint my first horizontal line now, so that I'll be able to make sure that all the subsequent lines that I paint will intersect with it at 90 degrees. So I'm going to use that to guide the way in which the lines are going to concentrate at the top. So I'm going to choose, let's see, we're going to start with a thin purple line at the bottom. So I'm going to start about there. And I'm just going to give myself a few targets to hit. All the way across to make it easier for me. That's going to be my first horizontal line. Wow. I'm going to go all the way around, right onto the front as planned. And do the same thing on the other side, right around onto the front. All right, there we go. So normally I would try to be making a pattern at about that kind of spacing, but I mean, you can see it, I'm quite shaky today. So I'm going to make the pattern a bit bigger than I normally would. But I mean, you can see where we're headed with this. So you, for your own, make it whatever size you feel comfortable with. So that's my spacing that I'm going to try to keep now. So there's one, and there's another one. And then My spacing will take me to about there. And then I'm going to do another one right about there. So those are going to be my vertical lines. So I'm going to just follow the fall of the cloak to put those lines in place. I discovered earlier today that Anne Forster did a tartan on this exact same miniature in one of her Twitch classes. And she used probably, I can't remember now, 20 vertical lines. So if you want to see how she did the spacing and how she lined them up, there's an example of that there on the Twitch stream. It's a completely different tartan from this one. It's actually quite a bit more complicated, but it's a good example of seeing how to figure out what the spacing of the pattern should be. And she actually has a completely different approach to painting the tartan than I do. So it's interesting to watch. It's worth taking a look at. Alrighty. So now I know what my spacing was horizontally. So I'm going to try to keep, so this is my distance of my squares. I'm going to try to keep that spacing going upwards now. So I'm going to lay out some landmarks. I'm going to estimate that distance is going to be about there. I think that was a little bit short. So I'm going to make it maybe, no, I'm going to keep it like that. So that's one repetition of the pattern. So that is going to be my second one there, my third one there, and then the next one is going to be just off the top of the cloak. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure that out again in a couple of spots, again to give myself some landmarks to hit. When I go and do that one's a bit off. There we go. And now we're going to go back in and do all of those lines. Now, quite often you're not going to be able to hit the space deep in the shadows. And don't worry about that. Just skip them. We can go back and fill in those missing gaps later.
Someone asked, what should you do when the cape has a lot of folds going in different directions?
It really ends up being the exact same process. When we did the, what was his name? Garish McRae or something like that during the ReaperCon Live, he's wearing a great kilt. And so it's folded in rolls around his waist. And then he has part of the kilt goes up over his shoulder. And it's very complex. So what I would do it exactly the same way as this. I keep I make the landmarks, I keep the pattern, but I identify the areas where the cloth is gathered. And anywhere the cloth is being gathered, like at the top of the cloak here, I'm going to paint these, what we did is our vertical lines here. I paint those vertical lines first. And that might mean that, you have a block with a set of vertical lines, then you skip, and then there's another block with vertical lines, and you skip, and there's another block. So the pattern ends up a little bit staggered, but I still lay out the landmarks exactly like this. So let's go back to Garish McRae there. Actually, that's not Garish, that's somebody else. looking at this one. See how complex that is? So when we did the vertical lines, actually this is not the figure we did for Reaper Live, but it's almost identical kilt. So we did the vertical lines on the part that goes over his shoulder first, did those landmarks, and then did the ones that cut across. So it's the same process, just you have to map it out quite a bit more carefully. And it's not as easy, for sure. And then there's something to be said for choosing the right model. I think this was a particularly good choice that was voted on. That's quite a nice space to work with. And you know, selecting the right model to be able to manage the complexity of it's gonna help your sanity. Also selecting the right tartan. Some of these tartans are really difficult to paint, and you know, starting out with something easier and then working your way up is gonna make a difference. All right, next thing is gonna be purple lines. So I already decided I'm gonna make the lower line there is gonna be a skinny one. So I'm just gonna jump in there and get that one done first. Remember, we paint the outside of each line, so there's gonna be 2 lines for each of the purple ones, and then we're gonna fill in the middle.
When you're done with this first line, can you swap the reference back up there?
Thank you. There we go. And now I'm gonna do the other one. I know what's missing. Bagpipe music. That's why I'm not as steady as I should be. I need to get some roaring bagpipe music on the go to get my hands in the mood. Normally I would shout something like, "Alexa, play Mull of Kintyre," or you know, something like that, and she'd put some good music on for me. Actually, during the summer, my daughter made for me a bagpipes playlist, and we'd have spontaneous Highland dancing and tartan painting sessions here in the studio. I'm sure the people downstairs appreciated that, but so exactly the same as I did it on the practice, I'm going to do these pairs of thin purple lines first. Actually, during the summer, Hillary made a little history of tartan handout, and I'll post that in my Discord again after this class. One of the fun things is to argue with people about what is tartan and what is plaid. Because lots of people look at plaid and say, "What's that tartan?" And then, of course, there's going to be a fight between the various factions as to what is a tartan and what is not. The simple way to think about it is there's all kinds of different kinds of plaid. Like the shirt I'm wearing right now is plaid, but it is not tartan. The tartans are specific patterns defined by their style, specific thread counts and colors.
I like that they all have names. That's pretty cool.
It's kind of cool, isn't it? I think one of my favorite moments with painting tartans was at with the local gaming convention. and this guy walked up to me dressed in his Outlander cosplay, and he said, "Oh, you're a miniature painter. Can you paint me this?" And he just kind of, and he was wearing that Wilson ancient tartan with all the orange lines on it. And I looked at him and said, "Let's do it. Let's do this." He just had to find a miniature to make it work. So he picked out that Aislinn figure and went for it.
How much of the white line is left behind?
So the white line is just a landmark.
Okay. You're just
So
using it to guide yourself.
It's just using it to guide myself. So I'm a little bit correcting some of my wobbliness as I'm doing these purple lines. That's why I paint the outside edge of the line, which lets me try to focus on just having one side of the line perfect or relatively straight. I don't have to worry about in the middle. That's why as you look in the center here, you can see the white is still visible in some spots and not in others. It's because I was more focused on making sure the purple line was basically the same width all the way, a little bit more consistent rather than worrying about having the, I'm not trying to save that white line because we're going to repaint it again at the end anyway.
Okay.
All right, so there's my first two thin lines. That's going to be a fat purple one, thin purple one, fat purple one. This one here is going to be a thin purple one, so I'm going to paint that now. And I have a dry blob on the end of the brush. It's like a mold line, right? As soon as you find the dry bit of paint, you have to remove it. Same as soon as you find the mold line, you've got to remove it. The judges will always find the mold lines. And now my paint is too thin. Let's fix that. So you can see how fast I'm going, right? Once you've got those key steps done, you've made your plan, it actually doesn't take very long to paint the tartan patterns. Especially if your paint is flowing well, your hands are steady. I'm starting to feel a bit steadier now as we go. Oh, darn it, I painted the wrong line. Doesn't matter, we'll fix that later.
Can you go up just a little bit?
Thank you. That's why I was steady, is because I drifted out of the camera shot. Yeah, so, you know, people will say, how long did it take you to paint that tartan? And the actual brushwork might have taken half an hour, 45 minutes. And what time is it now? It's 2:22. I'm pretty confident we're going to finish this pattern before the end of the class. It doesn't take that long once you've got everything planned out. But if you don't take the time to do the plan first, you're going to make mistakes along the way, and then it's going to take a long time. So the next thing, those are my thin purple ones. I'm going to do the fat purple ones. So I'm going to start with my bottom landmark ones. And I want these to be about twice as wide as the other ones. So I'm just going to give myself a couple of little marks here to make a judgment on. Is that going to be wide enough? Maybe a little wider than that, but not much wider than that. There, that's what I want. And now I'm just going to follow that through. Because I have the white line to use as my landmark. I'm not too worried about making more little hatch mark lines to keep myself lined up. But if you're not comfortable with that, you can just go through, make as many as you need to keep yourself on track. Some people measure, but I don't think we need to be that precise. Especially where we could just say that in this character's backstory, they caught their cloak on a thorn and their grandmother yelled at them about it, and that's why there's a mistake there. And that's all good. We can just kind of roll with that. And now I'm going to go back in and fill in the middle of this line. I might start singing bagpipe songs in a second. That wouldn't be good.
Were there certain family tartans, I'm assuming, just like there
Right,
would be like
absolutely.
family crests and stuff?
There's traditional clan type clan tartans
Mhm.
that have been around for quite a while, that have, have like a historic, like have a real history to them. Particularly like the Campbell, the Black Watch tartan. Those are some of the ones that were kind of most common, not most common, but a lot of people are associated with them. A lot of clans were associated with them. With those regiments were stood up. It was kind of drawn from clans. And but then in more modern times, kind of starting in Victorian times, I think, it became popular to have a tartan. So people started making them up or modifying the clan tartans to be a family tartan. So now if you go on that Scottish Registry of Tartans, put in your family name, there's a chance that somebody out there has already decided they want a tartan for that family or for that name and has registered one. And there's thousands and thousands and thousands of them now. And there are a few that have like a certain history of them where only certain people are allowed to use them and that kind of thing. Like Royal Stuart's an example of that. But Royal Stuart is one that, the Crown, as it were, has said they're not going to really enforce that. And it's almost become like a public domain tartan. That's why you see it. It's probably the one that people see the most commonly after um, after the Blackwatch tartan. The Blackwatch tartan is very popular, and really, certainly in Canada, it's very well known, right? Here in Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia tartan, you see that quite often because it's used in tourism activities like our tattoo. So you see that one quite often, but that one I get asked to paint fairly often, and that is a simple tartan, but it is really difficult to paint because it's got black and red and yellow lines right in the middle of all this blue, and it is really difficult. I have a local customer who's decided that his Infinity faction, he's playing Ariadna, and that particular faction has a lot of models that have kilts on them. So he has decided that his faction is going to be wearing the Nova Scotia tartan. And we had quite a big mass shooting here last spring, largest one in Canadian history, actually. And there was a real renewed interest in the Nova Scotia tartan at that time. And that's a lot of people you see it everywhere at the moment because people are kind of flying the flag. Right, this is coming along quite nicely. I'm glad I made it quite a large version of the pattern because, as I said, I don't think my hands are up to the job of doing it really small today. It's coming together pretty well. I hope people are able to follow along and their tartans are coming along nicely as well. Only got a few of these large lines left to do, and then we'll be into some details. So this is the first of the wider vertical lines. This one's going to be quite large. It's going to partly wrap around onto the front. is cool.
It's cool. I
Yes,
had
I've been
no.
painting a lot of Nova Scotia tartan. Sorry, go ahead, John.
No, go ahead. I just had no idea that there was I mean, I kind of knew that there was a huge history like it, like clan. It's like the same as like the old knight shields and the crests
It's a
and
bit like heraldry in a sense, yeah.
mhm. And I'm just glad that it's still kind of going today. I wonder what it'll look like in 20, 50, 60, 100 years, you know?
It is, there's a little bit of a fashion thing to it as well, right? So it comes and goes. And like I was saying, like in Victorian times, it was definitely a fashion statement more so than a like a family or a clan or a heraldry thing. I find that quite interesting to go and look at old catalog covers and things like that, or advertisements, because you find a lot of really interesting plaid patterns and tartan patterns that have been made into, at what was at the time kind of the haute couture fashion.
Mhm.
And I find actually some of those patterns are really interesting to try to adapt onto a miniature. And quite often they're not on kilts. And it's actually really hard to find well sculpted kilts to paint these patterns onto. The Corvus Belli Infinity kilts, some of those are the best that I've seen. The great kilts on the ones that I think it's Bob Oley did the
Mhm.
series of figures that Reaper has that are all in great kilts. Those are really well done. Um, and then you get some of the historical models have really well sculpted uh, kilts with proper pleats and apron front and all that. But there's not that many out there. So quite often you're just taking the pattern and adapting it onto something that wasn't intended to go on. So there we go. We got our purple lines all in place. Next step is purple squares. So I'm going to quickly go through and do those. Purple squares. Like I said, we're going to be systematic. So I'm going to do the big ones first, starting on the left at the top and work my way across. And they're going to be done pretty quickly. Actually, quite a small number of them compared to the practice one that we did. This pattern is much bigger, which means fewer lines. All right, that was it for the big ones. Now go back and do the small ones the same way. If you're having trouble making those intersections square, one thing I found helpful is you paint the top of the square with the tip of the brush, and then reverse the miniature and paint the lower half of the square facing the other way. And that makes it much easier to make it nice and neat and square. But for today, I'm going to just stick with doing it one way up on the camera. There we go. Is that one? There we go. Darker squares are painted. Now our next step was to go back in and do some hatch mark green lines over the purple. And my green is drying up quite a bit. And I think I'm going to add just a touch of linen white. I mean, really just a small amount of linen white to brighten it up just a bit, so that it will show up a bit better, because the the green that's on here now has the underpainting. So it's actually brighter than the paint. It's going to look brighter with the underpaint showing through than the green I'm going to put on the purple is going to be. When on an actual kilt, it's going to be about the same. So I'm going to try to lighten it up just a touch so that it matches the green adjacent to it. It doesn't have to be perfect, and you can adjust this, but that's what my intention is. And again, I don't have to be doing all of this, just enough to give the impression. So looking at this and looking at my swatch up there, the pattern is going to be high on the left, low on the right. So I'm going to keep that same orientation all the way through. And we're going to fly through this now. Well, we're going to fly through it if the paint actually flows. There we go. That's a bit better. And once again, I'm just going to say, it's the impression of tartan, not a detailed, exact replica. So if you're doing this and it doesn't look as complicated or as detailed as you would like, that's okay. If you would like to do it with more finesse than I'm putting into it right now, or do more hatch marks, more lines, it's totally up to you. But one of the reasons that I'm being a little bit rougher with it today is, well, as I said, I'm pretty shaky today, but also a little bit in the interest of time to make sure we get through all of this. And we don't, I think Rhonda's class is after this one, so we obviously don't want to interfere with the start of her class. So again, being systematic, I'm doing all the horizontal lines first. And now I'm going to go back and I'm going to do some of the vertical lines. Am I on screen still? I am, okay. There's a little dried bit. Reload. There we go.
This is just very satisfying to make. Like going through like your patterns, your steps of laying this out, and then doing vertical, and then doing horizontal.
It's very zen. Like I find it very calming, even though it's a little bit fiddly. And yeah, it's a pleasant thing to do, for sure. Well, maybe it's a masochistic thing, but it I agree with you. I really do. And there's probably out there people out there listening right now who just threw their miniatures at the screen. And that's okay too.
Yeah, some people like to have order. Some people like chaos. So.
Yeah. When I do the Reaper paint intakes at the local gaming shop, one of the first things I tell them at the start is, well, there's only one. The only mistake you can make is not getting any paint on your miniatures. The first thing I tell them. And the second thing I tell them is, I don't work here. So if it's not working out, throw your miniature across the room. Say, Geoff, it's not working. I'll get you a new one and we'll carry on. It's all good. It doesn't usually happen, but I've occasionally had people throw up their hand and say, Geoff, this is not working. I look over, say, you're right. And I take away their bones miniature, put it back in the box to be rebase coated, give them a new one, and then off we go. So all right, so that was our green hash marks. Now we're going to reapply our green lines. And if you've been watching in the palette, I just rebuilt my gray. Right, got lots of gray there to work with now. Got a little bit of that flow improver in there to make it easier for myself. I think I make that a little bit lighter. And as usual, now I'm going to have to clean the dried tip off of that to make sure it's all going to flow smoothly. And so these lines are going to stay. So I am concerned about making sure that these ones are pretty much where I want them to be. And there's a couple of tricks that you can use. One is you make the paint so desaturated, so thin, that it practically doesn't make a mark. And then you draw the line and it won't make much of an impression, but then you do it again, and then you do it again, and then you do it again. And each time, if you're a little bit left or right, it barely shows. But statistically, if 7 out of 10 are basically in the right spot, the line's going to look like it's right in the right spot by the time you're done. And that would look like this. So practically nothing visible, right? Doesn't do much of an impression at all. But I repeat that line a couple of times. And eventually I have a visible line that looks quite straight. That works pretty well. However, instead, I'm going to throw caution to the wind, and I am just going to go for it. And the white lines in the middle of the fat purple lines are the easiest ones. So I'm doing those first. And they're easiest because I can see the white line in the center that I painted at the start of this process. I can see that more easily in those wide purple lines. So at this stage, people usually start to feel a little bit tense because it's like they've done all this work and now they're going to wreck it by slapping white lines over top of it. So you start to clench your paintbrush a little tighter. You start to hold your breath a little bit. You start to focus intently. And all of those things contribute to being shaky. So if you start to feel that way, sometimes I just put it down, walk away, come back the next day, start again. Not start again, but then continue with these lines so that, you know, I'm feeling a little bit more comfortable about it. I, generally speaking, don't force myself to paint tartan if I'm not in the right mindset, or it's just not working. Because that is not a recipe for happy. I have discovered, though, as I paint more and more, that I'm willing to accept mistakes a lot more. And I've gotten quite a bit more efficient in my painting. So it doesn't take me very long to, well, as you saw today, it doesn't take very long to go from the plan to the tartan is mostly done. So if I was to slip now and put a great big white diagonal slash right across the middle of the whole figure, how long would it take to fix that? Well, let's pull out the airbrush, spray it with primer, redo the base coat, reapply all these tartan lines, but I've already kind of got a plan. I've learned the lay of the land of the miniature, right? I know where things are. I know which folds I'm going to use and all that good stuff. It'd probably only take me, you know, an hour or 90 minutes to get back to this stage again on this miniature. I mean, from like maybe 2 hours, let's say, to go prime it over again, zenithal, prime it, and do it again. It'll only take a couple of hours. So that makes me a lot less worried about making mistakes in the final stages. Plus, I feel a lot more comfortable about fixing my mistakes, and that's in large part thanks to taking classes and learning how to fix the mistakes. So in this one, actually, if I was to just make a big mess on the cloak, I wouldn't have to repaint the whole thing. I would just repaint the cloak gray, then redo the base coat, and carry on from there. That wouldn't take very long at all. Actually, getting pretty close to the end of this. I'm quite liking this one. So after we get these last white lines put in place, we're going to go back and do some quick purple hash marks across the white lines. Wrong, we're going to do our our white squares first at all those intersections. And then we're going to do some quick purple hash marks. I am going to be that guy and fix my mistake right there. Cover that over, pretend it never happened. See, no proof, no proof. Well, I mean, video that's going to be on the internet for eternity, but other than that, there's no proof. All right, I'm going to quickly, yes, very quickly, do some purple hash marks, keeping the same orientation. White squares, we're going to do white squares. There they are, white squares. So everywhere that there's a white line intersection point, I'm doing a little brush tip wiggle to give the impression that there's a square there. It wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, under high magnification and a nice camera, but for our gaming piece, it's going to work pretty well. Am I on camera? I am, okay. I had intended to mix the ink in with this to show you how that works, and I of course forgot because I'm kind of running out of time here. So I'm going to finish this instead and do the final step that ties everything together. And then if there's any questions, we'll take them. And if I have 30 seconds left at the end, I'll show you how to do a quick ink paint mixed line, which doesn't take very long at all. There we go, looking pretty good. I'm gonna use a few quick purple hash marks. Kind of break up that white line just a bit. And we got to keep them in the same orientation as the other ones that we did. So I'm going to do them in these shadow areas predominantly. And like I said, I'm not doing all of them, just enough to give the impression that they're there. Anywhere that it's see, like the white line really kind of seems a bit too bright, that's where I'm going to put them. Break up the line. So like right here, that looks too bright to me, right? That's the piece that where I made the mistake and then fixed it. So I'll break that up a bit. It's also a little bit in the shadow, so that helps with making it not feel quite as bright. Okay, I'm happy with that. It's pretty good overall. Pattern right around the front. So like with any freehand that you do, you don't want to just leave it at that stage. You want to try to glaze over it to tie it back into the background a bit. So it looks more like it's a pattern in the surface rather than something painted onto the surface. So in this case, what I'm going to do, I'm going to make a very thin glaze out of the green. Okay. And I'm going to glaze that over pretty much the whole cloak. And I'm going to use the Reaper wash medium to do that. Now I'm using this just as a way to thin it down. I'm not going to just let this go everywhere. I'm going to be a little bit more careful when I apply it. Assuming that it's not so dried up, it won't come out. And generally speaking, I find that the tartans look better with a matte varnish on them. If you give them a satin or a gloss varnish, they get a they get a natural reflective highlight that doesn't look right, because in reality they're very, very matte. So I try not to, even if the rest of the miniature might have either no varnish or a satin varnish on them or something like that, I'll make sure that there's a matte varnish on the certainly if it's a wool tartan, to dull it down. So the amount of paint that I've got on the brush here is very small. Show you on the demo card there. There's my finger. Not much at all. Just a little bit to push everything back a bit. If I do that on the card, of course I keep drifting off camera now, right? Just a hint of it, just to take things down just a little bit. And I'm going to put that over everything. Now, if you've got yellow lines or red lines in your tartan, using an ink like raw umber or or burnt sienna, those yellow and red inks, they will really help bring out the red lines and also tie the tartan back into the background. And if you've got a lighting effect on the miniature, choosing an ink that enhances that lighting effect will also give a nice, like say this was had a warm fire glow or something like that nearby, then using a yellow ink might give a bit of a warmth to the overall look of the tartan and it fit into its environment a bit better. Okay, there we go. That's enough just to glaze over like that, just to kind of, and once that dries, things will look a little bit better tied into the background. Right on. So that's the process. And with about 10 minutes left. So I'm going to put her off screen, and John, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them, but I'm also going to concurrently do some white lines with this mixing ink in.
Francis had the question of what was the ratio to mix the green, and if I remember correctly, it was 50-50 of the
That's
teal
right.
and the green.
It was equal volumes of the marine teal and warm green. I don't think that that's called warm green, but it's warm green number 2, 9011, I think is the number. It's funny how some of the bottles of paint really fade and other ones don't fade at all. Like on my, those 2 bottles of paint, here, that is a terrible segue.
Leaf green.
Bottles of paint have all been side by side with each other and getting the exact same lighting. Some are completely gone and others are barely affected. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, a lot of people are saying leaf green.
Leaf green, thank you. I'll write that on the bottle. Where'd that bottle go? Leaf green.
And then there's one question from Rick. This was at the beginning of the class, but it wasn't pressing towards the actual model, so I was saving it towards the end. He says, I found your Hecatina Facebook page. Do you have a website? And do you offer online classes for your American neighbors?
I do. And I do. So it's hecatina.ca is the website. There should be a link to it off the Facebook page. And if you're interested in seeing what I'm working on, what I'm painting, my most current stuff is usually on Twitter. My website tends to be a little bit out of date in terms of the photos on it. But there's a link on there that you can click that says painting classes. There's a link there that says visit our studio that's got our map, our phone number. If you want to take an online painting class, you just hit the link and instructions are all right there. And we do it exactly like this format. And if we're running a workshop, there's a gaming store a couple of blocks from here that we cooperate with. And we want to, when we run a workshop, we take over their whole gaming area and they let us do that for free. And we run the painting classes up there in their gaming area. Super friendly. It's called HFX Games. They're a kind of a typical local gaming store that's also a card and gaming, like sports gaming memorabilia store. Super guys. So for these lines, I've got about 50-50 of the linen white and Liquitex white ink. And you can see between the two, the ink mix behaves quite differently from the just straight paint. And I'm going to put a little bit of flow enhancer in that as well. And you can see how it's really kind of pulling together like that on the palette. So when I do those lines on the sheet here, I get it on the screen, right? You'll be able to see the ink pull together in a thinner line after the brush goes by. And I get really nice razor sharp lines as a result. And because the ink has quite a high pigment density, it's quite saturated, get nice coverage from these lines as well. And I find that adding combining the linen white and the white ink gives me quite a nice, an appropriate color for the tartans anyway, because the natural wools tend not to be like a pure white or like a titanium white or anything like that. You want something a little bit less bright than that. And it flows like brilliant. I mean, I haven't had to reload since I started, and I'm doing tons and tons of lines. Works really good. My favorite kind of lines are patterns where you've got pairs of lines. And then there's intersections of those pairs of lines. And that just reminded me of another fun little trick. There's that classic thing that happens with your brush stroke where you lift the brush, it leaves a slightly darker dot. So when you're doing your pattern, you can make your lines, but then lift off at the corner where the lines intersect. And that'll help create that effect of the brighter dot at the intersection. And that way you don't have to go back through and paint all those tiny squares, especially if you're in good painting shape and you're able to do really, really tiny lines. That will save you a lot of time in the process. Still haven't reloaded that brush. It's still going and going and going and going and going. And that's, again, why I love these 8404s. Is a great brush for this technique. The other one I've really enjoyed using lately is I'm using a #2 Rosemary & Co. And that's got a great big brush on it, quite a bit bigger than the Raphael. The only difference I find is that the Rosemary & Co., the tip is not quite as sharp. That's like the main bristle's been trimmed at the end, so it's not quite as razor sharp, but it's brilliant for doing long, long straight lines. All right, that is all the content that I had. If there's no other questions, John, then I think we are at the end. If you enjoy doing the tartan painting, I encourage you, please join our Facebook group. Post what you did today. We'll have a discussion about painting tartan. If you find an interesting tartan, share it to that group. Always interested in seeing that. Anything you painted today, please post a photo on the Discord so we can see how things went for you. If you have critique or points on this class, things you liked, you didn't like, whatever it might be, send me a message. I'm always interested in trying to improve the class. And really, thanks for painting along. I'm kind of curious to know how many people actually survived pretty good, almost in the same numbers we started with. That's pretty fabulous. So thanks very much for painting along with us. And thank you, John, for your great support as the moderator. And since I've got you online here, thanks very much for everything you're doing running this event. I think these events are fabulous, and I know you're a big part of making these things work. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's been fun. This one we had a lot more time to prepare for, and the next one I think is going to be a lot more exciting. So I would look forward to the future of Reaper as well as the future stuff. So
Right on.
yeah, just things we've learned on virtual we're going to be doing for in person, and then virtual is just going to keep getting better from here. So
yeah, like you were saying this morning on the Twitch stream about the coffee catch up.
mm-hmm.
I think that's fabulous. And the way you guys have been doing the Twitch stream, like daily summary and all that kind of stuff. I can just see you guys with a giant screen at the back of the main painting room with a big screen up doing that kind of narrative while people are coming and going in the room.
Walking in. Yeah, it's going to be great.
Why not have Rhonda or, Anne give their key classes on layering or whatever it might be on the big screen to the whole room?
Yeah,
Like,
we've
so much opportunity.
With document cameras and stuff, we're going to have TVs in all the rooms so people can see better. Things like that. We're planning. We're planning.
Yeah, you could tell I'm keen on it. You guys want me to be part of it in any way? You just got to say,
Oh, yeah.
Give us your arm, and I will. I'm there. I'm in.
This is your last class of the weekend, I believe, right?
It is. I'm going to go and follow a couple of other classes that are about to happen now because I'm a glutton for punishment, and I've got about 300 lines of text to type as feedback for various people on the Discord too. So,
all right.
Well, I'm out of here. I'm going to go drink some water. Thank you, Angela, and thanks again, John. And thanks everybody. Right. See you soon.